We welcome you back to this channel. In this video, we will talk about family curse stories, where our protagonists are heirs to spells and curses from their ancestors. Each story reveals how the past can haunt the present. Go ahead, turn off the lights, and let's take one more step into the world of the unknown.
The price of magic.
I always knew my grandmother was different. The stories told in the village about her varied, from the most benign rumors to the most sinister. They said she had been a witch, a true sorceress with dark powers. When I was a child, I was fascinated by the thought that maybe I had some magic in my veins. But now, as an adult, I wished all of that was just tales. My name is Rose, and it all began when I turned 25. My grandmother had died a few months earlier, leaving me her old house on the outskirts of the village. It was an old structure, with worn wooden walls and windows that looked like blind eyes. Despite its state, I decided to move there, driven by a strange mix of nostalgia and the need to start anew. The first night in the house was quiet. The calm of the rural night lulled me into a deep sleep. But at dawn, I woke up with a feeling of unease. I had a strange dream, though I couldn't remember the details. I decided to thoroughly explore the house, hoping to uncover some forgotten memory from my childhood. While searching the attic, I found an old chest covered in dust. Inside was a collection of strange objects: jars with dried herbs, black candles, and an ancient spell book. At the bottom of the chest, I found a letter addressed to me, written in my grandmother's unmistakable handwriting. Dear Rose, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer with you, and you have inherited our old curse. Our blood is marked by a dark power that manifests in each generation. Be careful, dear, for the gift of magic comes with a terrible price. You must break the cycle before it is too late. My skin prickled as I read those words. A curse? I had always thought the stories about my grandmother were exaggerations. However, that night, the first manifestation of the curse left me with no doubt. I was in the kitchen making a cup of tea when I heard a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the whispers grew clearer. They came from the hallway. I set my cup down and walked slowly toward the source of the sound. When I reached the hallway, I saw a dark shadow at the end, a human figure that couldn't be real. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice trembling. The shadow did not respond, but it moved toward me. It did not walk. It floated, gliding over the wooden floor without making a sound. Its form was indistinct, shifting and undulating like black smoke. I felt an icy cold envelop me, and a feeling of despair took hold of me. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them, the shadow was gone. That night I couldn't sleep. The whispers continued, sometimes soft, sometimes intense. The shadow appeared in different parts of the house, always watching me, always waiting. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its dark form and felt its oppressive presence. As days passed, the manifestations became more intense. Objects in the house would fall by themselves. Candles would light and extinguish without explanation. One night, I woke up with scratches on my arms, marks I couldn't have made myself. Fear became my constant companion. Desperate, I returned to the chest and the spellbook. I spent the entire night studying the yellowed pages, searching for any clue on how to break the curse. Finally, I found a ritual that required a series of specific ingredients. I gathered the ingredients and waited for nightfall. When the time came, I drew a circle of salt on the attic floor and lit the black candles. I began to recite the words of the spell, my voice trembling as I spoke. As I recited, the shadow appeared again, but I continued, focusing on the words, hoping to free myself from that dark presence. Finally, with an agonizing scream, the shadow disappeared. The candles went out abruptly, plunging the attic into darkness. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted but relieved. I knew I had broken the cycle, at least for now. The house became quieter after that night. The whispers ceased and objects stopped moving by themselves. However, a part of me knew the curse wasn't entirely destroyed, just contained. Now I live with the awareness that my grandmother's dark power still resides in me, like a latent shadow waiting for the right moment to resurface. From that day on, I learned to face my fears, for I believe the shadow may have been banished, but it is waiting for the moment to return.
Inheritance of death.
It all began when my mother, searching for answers to the strange deaths in our family, found an old diary that belonged to my great-grandfather Charles. The dust and yellowed pages revealed a story that seemed straight out of a horror tale. Hidden beside the diary was a small amulet. Charles had lived in a small mountain village and had been a man of great greed and bad manners. According to the diary, he had deceitfully stolen a valuable amulet from an old woman in the village. Upon realizing the deceit, she cursed him, a curse that would affect his descendants. The amulet my mother found was the same one. The curse manifested in a series of tragic and mysterious events over the generations, affecting only the men in the family. My grandfather and father had died under inexplicable circumstances, always upon reaching the age of 35. Now I was about to turn that age and felt the shadow of death looming over me. I couldn't ignore the fate that seemed inevitable, but I also wasn't willing to sit back and do nothing. I decided to investigate more about the curse and find a way to break it. I returned to the village of my ancestors, a place forgotten by time, full of ruined houses and deserted streets. After searching for a while, I found the old woman's house mentioned in the diary, a dilapidated cabin on the edge of the forest. The atmosphere was suffocating, as if the air was heavy with dark power. Inside the cabin, I found an altar covered in dust. In the middle of the altar was a photograph of Charles, surrounded by unlit candles. There was also a picture of the amulet, a beautiful silver pendant with a black stone in the center. I had to carry the amulet and return it. I needed to contact the old woman, or what was left of her spirit, to ask for forgiveness and end the curse once and for all. That night, armed with courage and desperation, I ventured into the forest in search of answers. The full moon illuminated the path, and the sounds of nature seemed amplified, creating an eerie symphony. I reached a clearing in the forest where a large, dry, and twisted tree stood in the center. I felt a cold presence and knew I had arrived at the right place. I began to recite an apology prayer that I had found in my great-grandfather's diary, holding the amulet high as I spoke those words. The wind picked up, and a murmur spread through the clearing. Suddenly, a figure like a shadow appeared before me. It was the old woman, but her appearance was ghostly, with sunken eyes and skin so pale it seemed almost transparent. Her voice was a raspy whisper. "Why have you come here?" she asked. With a trembling voice, I explained my situation, told her that I didn't agree with what my great-grandfather had done, and that I wanted to make things right. I begged her to break the curse. The old woman watched me with an intensity that made me shiver. She told me that the amulet must be purified with fire. Only then would the curse be broken. I understood what I had to do. I lit a small fire with dry leaves and branches I found in the forest. Once it was fully ablaze, with trembling hands, I threw the amulet into the center. The flames began to rise, the branches crackling. I watched the process until only ashes remained. Among the ashes, I could see that the amulet was intact. I carefully blew away the ashes and cautiously retrieved the amulet. The figure of the old woman began to fade, but before disappearing completely, she whispered, "The curse is broken." Back at the cabin, I felt a great weight lift from my shoulders. By the time I looked at the amulet again, I noticed that the black stone had disappeared, leaving only the silver frame. I realized that the object had lost its power. I returned home feeling free for the first time. The curse had been broken, but the memory of that night and the figure of the old woman would never leave me. I learned that the mistakes of the past can have terrible consequences, and that forgiveness and redemption sometimes require sacrifices we are not prepared to make.
The sisters.
I received the necklace on a cold November afternoon, the same day we buried my grandmother. It was an antique piece, intricately and opulently designed, with a silver locket hanging from a delicate chain. My mother gave it to me after the funeral, saying that it had been in our family for generations, passed down from mother to daughter. The piece itself was stunning, but there was something about it that made me feel uneasy from the moment I saw it. When I held the necklace in my hands, a chill ran through my body. The texture of the chain was strangely rough, and the locket seemed to vibrate slightly. My mother, noticing my reaction, assured me that it was normal, that all the women in our family had felt it. That night, unable to get the necklace out of my mind, I placed it on my nightstand. A few hours after I went to bed, I was awakened by a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but when the sound became clearer, I realized someone was calling my name. I got out of bed, unsure of what was happening. The room was wrapped in shadows, and the air felt dense and heavy. I turned on the light, and my eyes were immediately drawn to the necklace. The locket was open, something I swore I hadn't done. Inside was a small black and white photograph of a young woman I didn't recognize, but who bore an uncanny resemblance to my grandmother. The following days were a series of strange events. They started with small details: objects moving out of place, doors closing on their own, whispers in the dark. But then the manifestations became more intense. One night when I woke up, I found the figure of a woman standing at the foot of my bed. She was tall and slender, with an ethereal presence that seemed to float rather than walk. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were two dark shadows that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. Her face was hidden by a white veil that moved as if carried by an invisible breeze. I felt as if my body was trapped in some kind of trance. My breathing became erratic, and cold sweat drenched my forehead. My heart was pounding with an almost painful force. I must have fainted from fear because I don't remember anything else from that night. The next day, I decided to investigate more about the necklace. My mother took me to the family library, where we kept old diaries and documents. According to the writings, the locket originally belonged to an ancestor of ours, Helen, who had been accused of witchcraft in the 18th century, and, before being executed, had cast a curse on the necklace. To break the curse, I had to find a way to reconcile the past. The diaries indicated that Helen had been betrayed by her own sister, and her descendants would bear the curse of the locket. The only way to free ourselves from the spell was to have the descendants of both family branches forgive each other. Tracking down the descendants of Helen's sister was an arduous task, but I finally found a woman named Mary, a genealogist who had also researched her family's history. When I told her my story, Mary was surprised, but she agreed to help me. We arranged to meet at our family's old house, now uninhabited and shrouded in an air of abandonment. In the main room, with the necklace in my hands, Mary and I held hands. At that moment, a gentle breeze swept through the room, and the locket of the necklace began to glow with a warm light. The figure of the woman reappeared, but this time her presence wasn't threatening. I could see her face. It was both beautiful and sad. Her eyes, once empty, were now filled with deep melancholy, and a solitary tear rolled down her cheek. Helen nodded slowly, and with a melancholic smile, she faded into the air. From that day on, the paranormal events ceased, and the necklace lost its cold vibration. Though it remained an impressive piece of jewelry, it no longer carried the same ominous weight. I finally understood that the curse had been broken and that Helen had finally found peace.
Thank you for journeying with us through the dark passages of these stories. If you enjoyed them, give us a like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss more tales of terror. Until next time, where fear will once again be your companion.